Well, I think it makes it a little bit more interesting when someone sees on the inside front cover inspired by a true incident, not necessarily a true story, because I had to fictionalize their lives, but definitely inspired by a true incident. And the other neat thing that I was able to do was to go back to my hometown's library and archives and ask the archivist, is there any information here about that family that lived on such and such a street in this. My gosh, she brought out a box of newspaper clippings and photographs and all kinds of things dating back, but it wasn't from my main character's world. It was the other sisters, the two other sisters that emigrated to Nova Scotia in around 1900, and their stories are as interesting, except mostly everything was written in Danish, and it would take a monumental task to translate.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to Living the Next Chapter. I have a Canadian author on the podcast, which makes me very happy because I love getting more Canadian voices onto the show because, again, I'm in Canada, so that makes sense. Bruce is here with me, and he's from the best part of Canada. Sorry, everybody else. He's from the best part of Canada, and you need to go there. And I'm excited. Bruce is here to talk about all of his books, his journey as an author, maybe a little bit about New Orleans and golfing. All kinds of stuff might come up, but Bruce is here, and I'm so excited to have him here. Bruce, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Dave. I'm happy to be here for sure.
Excellent. Tell everybody why I'm telling everybody how beautiful this place is. Where are you, Bruce, in this big world of ours?
Wow, I'm in the Far East, Dave, okay? Yeah. I'm in Nova Scotia, Canada, on the eastern seaboard, and I am in the capital city of Halifax, which is about around 1 million people now. We've had quite an uptick in population since the beginning of the pandemic, and I live right downtown. I had been away for a number of years in Toronto, living in Toronto for 25 years, but every Maritimer comes home. And I came home, or back to the province, I should say, in 2004, and happy to be here.
Excellent. Amazing. For those who haven't been to your part of the world, you do dabble in tourism and helping people have great experiences where they travel. Tell us a must-see thing, do, activity, place to visit if I come to Halifax for the very first time and I have never been there. I land at the airport. Where do I go first?
Oh boy. Probably the most iconic lighthouse in the country is about a 45-minute drive out of Halifax, and it's called Peggy's Cove. It is still a small fishing village, a fishing community. But it's got this little mini lighthouse on the rocks. And as I say, it's iconic. It's probably the most photographed place in Canada as far as a tourist attraction is concerned. And because it's so close to the city, like I say, 45 minutes away, people that come here on cruise ships might decide to take one of the many buses that go on side trips and end up in Peggy's Cove. So as much as I hate to admit it, because I come from a town in Nova Scotia with, I think, a much more beautiful lighthouse called Cape Verschoux. No, Peggy's is a really nice spot and probably a must-see if you're only in Halifax for a day or two.
I remember getting on the plane to come home. Before I got to the plane, there's like tanks of fresh live lobster in the airport, which I thought was very unique. And then they're loading the lobsters on the plane before we leave to fly them back to Ontario. And I'm like, I don't see this often where I'm from. So I'm like, that's pretty unique. So I bought my kids some little stuffed lobsters. So I brought those home, little toys for them. And I have a lighthouse behind me on my shelf as well from the airport and stuff. But I loved going out there. I was there for a week. I tell you, it was really hard to get back in the plane to come back home. There's a little piece of me I left back there. So it's a great place.
I think so. And your heritage being a Campbell of Scottish ancestry. Right. Our Scottish Nova Scotians, I guess you could say, really started coming here in the early 1800s and then just populated the whole province. But primarily, these Scottish Nova Scotians would be in Cape Breton, on Cape Breton Island, which is a causeway away from the mainland. And Cape Bretoners like to say that, well, we allowed Nova Scotia to join us rather than the other way around. So Cape Bretoners are like Newfoundlanders. They're a feisty bunch who love music and entertainment and parties and Kayleys
Yeah.
and all of that good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're not into being loved and adored and cared for, don't go there because people are going to love you and you're going to feel like you're part of the family just by showing up and being a tourist there and walking around and meeting great people. So it's a great place to visit for sure.
Well, if I ever meet the mayor, I will tell him.
Okay,
You
okay,
said
good. All right, yeah, put a nice word in for me. I like that. So Bruce, let's talk to the authors that are listening. There's two components to this podcast that I'm trying to build a bridge. I want to connect authors like you. You've been doing this for a while. You've got some great books out in the world. I have authors that listen to this show. They're just starting. Like they just started like yesterday. They're brand new to writing. They dream of having a book of their own. And here you are with multiple. So you've learned something in the process that could really help a fellow author on their journey, whether encouraging them, some knowledge you have that they don't have it yet. And then after that, we're going to talk to the readers and kind of, they may not be authors, but they're looking to connect with you as an author. So before we get to the readers that are here, let's talk to the authors. And I'm looking for some encouragement from you to them on how they can continue writing, stay motivated. What can you tell an author listening that you would have loved to hear before you sat down to write your first book?
that's a great question. Great way to start our conversation. I think authors and aspiring authors, new authors, debut authors, all have to do a certain amount of research because it is a business. Having a book published is most definitely a business that you have to take seriously. And there's three ways to get your book published. One is by traditional publishing. That would be most of the books that you'd see in any given bookstore anywhere in the country. Then there's hybrid publishing, which means you're hiring a company which will assist you by getting the book cover designer, the editor, and even the interior formatter of the book designed so that all that kind of heavy lifting stuff is being done by a partner. So a hybrid publisher. And that hybrid publisher will take a certain percentage of the profits eventually, as of course does a traditional publisher.
Right.
In fact, a much larger chunk of your sales. Then the third way of getting your book published is by doing it yourself. So it's the real DIY, do it yourself. But before you do it yourself, you've got to learn a little bit about the business and understand the differences among those three types of publishing. And do take it seriously. It's not something like I think I'll write a book in 10 days or a month, and then I'm going to self-publish it on Amazon and it's going to sell 1 million copies. And you can't deceive yourself in this business. And I believe it or not, even though I've been sort of a journalist my whole adult life in the lifestyle and travel categories, I never thought of writing a book until the pandemic made me stay home, made us stay home, and you're locked in. And that's when I thought, oh, gee, I'd love to write a book, but how the heck do I do it?
Right.
And that's when I understood the differences among the three types of publishing, traditional, hybrid, and do it yourself, and thought, okay, I'm going to try it and do it myself.
Okay.
And that's how it started.
Was there any hiccups along the way when you're learning how to do all of this? Write a book and
Oh,
all the publishing at the same time?
yeah, a few million
A few million.
hiccups. Yeah.
Good. That's encouraging. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's I hate to say that, COVID helped, but really by being stuck inside and everybody else seemed to be reading and all I was doing was researching about how to write.
Mm.
I'd never written a novel, or the most I'd ever done was probably a short story 20, 30 years ago. I had dabbled in script writing. I had lots of articles that would range from 650 words to maybe 5,000 words, but never a novel. And so I remember at the time in early 2020, Googling, how do you write a novel?
Mm.
And I can't even remember the sources at the time, but that gave me the encouragement because I thought, well, damn it, I've got the experience as a writer, but writing a book is so different. And then you have the decision, is it going to be a fiction book or nonfiction? And for me, it was like going back to my childhood where you're telling stories to your buddies, to your friends in the neighborhood. You're telling crazy stories and yet this time you're literally writing it down on a computer.
Mm. All right. Any authors that you've always loved or followed as a reader and kind of inspired you, and maybe a little bit of who they are as an author kind of showed up in your writing as well?
Yeah, most definitely. By the time I was in my teen years, uh, I don't know if I how I got the book, but it was one of James Michener's major books, and he wrote so many that were all historical in tone, but were also very very informative about a country or a period of time. For example, The Drifters. I remember was written about the hippie era and mostly set in um, southern Spain and Morocco.
Hmm.
That might have triggered my interest in travel writing later on because his novel was so evocative of that time and that scene, the hippie scene. But he also wrote other amazing books that like Caribbean or Hawaii. Um, that just I just fell in love with his writing. And when I think back on it now, that was in I mean, he was publishing rather at the height of his work was probably in the 60s and 70s, early 80s. And to think there was no such a thing as the internet where he could do any research. I found out later that his wife was a great um, researcher and a great help to him, but that would mean countless hours in libraries and archives to be able to write a novel that would make the reader feel like he or she was literally back in time. So I admired his work so much. Arthur Haley, a Canadian novelist, was also one of my favorites. Um, so yeah, I liked novels that were set in a particular time or in a particular place but completely fictionalized and you're just drawn into the characters.
So this isn't meant to be an awkward question, more of a celebration question for you. You're talking about all these authors that you love that have inspired you. How does it feel for you to think that there's someone listening to this that you are their inspiration? They read your books, they look up to you as a fellow author, or they just love what you do, and you're the person that they talk about. If they were asked that question, how does that feel to know that your words can travel and impact a reader to that point where they talk about you with admiration and love and respect for what you do?
Well, you feel blown away.
Right.
First of all, I mean, you'd have to be a complete egomaniac to just take it in stride,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't. Every time I there's a positive review that shows up about one of the books, or even some people contact me through my website, and then we end up talking on the phone, and I answer questions and that sort of thing. In fact, there's one avid reader who I was talking to around New Year's, and he was having trouble finding my most recent novel, Grow Up, Rory Rafferty. So we were discussing that. Anyway, it turns out that he did find it in a Halifax bookstore, bought it, and now he's invited me out for lunch because he really wants to talk about it. So
Wow.
that's kind of when you're not expecting these things to happen, and you forget once the book, or you often forget once the book is published, that yeah, there's some complete strangers out there reading it, including people who are only getting their books from libraries.
Mm,
And that's why it's also so important for authors to remember, don't think that you shouldn't try to get your book into different library systems in your province or your state or your country.
yeah.
It's very important.
Excellent. I just think that as new authors listening, they don't even they're so focused on just getting the book done and published that they don't really think about the lasting impact that this book might have once it's out in the world, and the fact that people will come and find you and you become the voice that they resonate with. You become the voice that they look forward to reading and understanding and being part of your community. So I'm envisioning, Bruce, there's people listening to this who have been following your journey as an author for a while. And they finally get to hear your voice on a podcast, for example. And they're like, oh my gosh, it's Bruce. Like, I feel like I know you through your books. And now I get to hear from you. I just think it's great that we can have conversations around this and bring more people to you and celebrate the people who have been following your journey for a while.
Well, and those people I appreciate so much because they also provide feedback when you ask for it. For example, anybody who would subscribe to my newsletter, which comes out about every couple of months, but if they subscribe to it through my website, uh, those are the people that you can bounce ideas off of as well. You can talk about perhaps a work in progress or an idea you have to should I do a part 4 in the trilogy or no, maybe just leave it where it is. And I'm always blown away too by how excited people get about certain characters or characters that me as the writer that I kill off because I'm either bored with them or I don't know what to do with them. And then you hear from a reader who says, "Oh my God, I'm so glad that you got rid of that one because because they begin to feel that these characters are real people, and when indeed they're not. They're amalgamations of probably everybody I've ever met in my life. That's how they're why they're characters, and they're fictitious.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's interesting because it seems like when the authors that I talk to, a book is kind of like a monologue. It's you talking to an audience. Here's the story. Here's my whatever. And you're sending it out kind of a monologue, you to them. But it becomes a dialogue when your audience starts to fall in love with it and then they have opportunity to talk to their favorite author and have conversation. You go from monologue to dialogue. And I love the community side that authors have today, where maybe, 30 years, 40 years ago, that wasn't even a possibility. Like, how would I even reach out and talk to my favorite author? I had no way to connect with them.
No, and I credit you with having a podcast like this because it can potentially reach an awful lot of people. But you're absolutely right. I mean, let's face it, 20 odd years ago, the only time you would meet or hear an author is at a book signing and or a book reading from that author, whether it be at a library or a bookstore or whatever. And now it just seems like, my gosh, there's the interviews are fast and furious and from all over the place. And once again, people have understood that the genres can be so different. I guess I could be pegged a historical fiction writer because I don't write crime or romance
Yeah.
or whatever, but I can incorporate other genres in my writing, like mystery and that type of thing.
Yeah. I like that. So let's get into your books, Bruce. You have the trilogy, and then you have your most recent release as well. Let's talk about the trilogy. Was the trilogy always meant to be a trilogy, or did it develop over time into becoming a trilogy? Like, for readers who don't really understand how a trilogy works from an author's perspective, we don't really know how you got here to have these three books together as a group. How did you approach the trilogy?
I probably from a business standpoint.
Okay. Really? Okay.
Yeah, in 2020, I took an online course that's from a fellow over in England, Mark Dawson, and it was called the Self-Publishing Formula. And I remember one of the lessons was that if you're going to write a book, think ahead that it should be a trilogy because if if your reader likes the debut novel, the first novel, chances are he or she is going to buy the second and the third and the fourth. And that's why you'll see some best-selling authors today that they've stuck in their the same genre, even the same character, for 15, 16 books. I can't quite imagine doing that. But when I wrote the first one, and the reception from it was pretty good. I did leave the end of that book on a cliffhanger because I thought if people really like it, then they're going to want to know what happened to my main character,
Hmm.
and that's how the second book developed, and then the third book. So a trilogy that any author writes can be sequential. Excuse me, sequential. So in other words, you have to read part two after part one and then
Yeah.
part three after part
Yeah.
two,
Yeah.
or it can be interlinked. And that seems to be the most perhaps common or in my case, a little easier to do each of the three books interlinked. Technically, you could read part three before reading the first book
Okay.
because the storyline for each book is totally different. The only thing that remains the same is perhaps the family connection or maybe one or two characters. But I love that ability to jump forward. For example, in my third book, I went from 1935-36 in the second book to 1956-58 in the third book. And the interlinked part of it was the little boy that you met in book two was now a fully grown adult man married in
Hmm.
part three because of the jump in time.
Okay.
If when a series is sequential, I just think it's you better have a darn good story that people are waiting with desperation to read each so-called chapter or each book in the series.
Yeah. When I think of an author writing in a trilogy, for example, in my mind, I envision the typical police mystery show where the police are gathered in the room. They got a big board. There's photos. There's string, push pins, and this lines up with this, which lines up with that, and he's connected to that person, and they're trying to map out this big overall picture of the crime and trying to solve it through all the connections. I'm envisioning an author kind of going, "All right, I got this big story, and I've got all these supplemental characters I have to kind of weed in, and he's
Yep.
connected to them, and they're connected to these people." And I just kind of envision this mad scientist author trying to make sense of all this big world and then getting into the writing. Is that kind of how
That's
things
kind
work?
of, well, for me, that's kind of how it worked because writing a family saga that starts in 1883 in Sweden and then ends up in Halifax, Nova Scotia in
Hmm.
1935. I had to do a family tree literally from first with the main characters in book number one. Then when I develop book number two, you're adding on to who's related to who and why. And so there's a second family tree in book two. And then in book three, it's 20 years later. So then you're dropping down that tree and adding more kids and all that and deaths. That was the other hard thing too, that I know that readers are very, very astute and they notice mistakes right away.
Mm.
So I thought, okay, get some of my characters born in a really easy year to remember, 1900. And so in 1922, I'll remember, oh yeah, right, she's 22 in 1922 because she was born in 1900. So I was keeping to the birth dates and deaths very, very carefully. I didn't. I guess maybe that comes again from my background as a journalist. I wanted at least those things to be incredibly factually, not factual. What's the word I'm looking for? In other words, you couldn't disprove them. I
Okay.
was making sure that everybody really was the age that I said they were, say, in chapter one or something.
Yeah. You're right, because authors or the readers are they're very detailed, and because they're seeing it outside of the writer, they're seeing it from a different perspective. So they're going to
Oh
pick up
yeah,
on things that are like, that doesn't make sense. How does
yeah,
this person here in this time frame and doing this in this time frame? That doesn't work. You're like,
Yeah,
oh, I didn't even see that. So,
especially with historical fiction,
yeah.
because people will say, "Oh, that doesn't sound right to me. I'm going to look that up myself." And I've had people contact me and say, "No, no, that's not right because Veuve Clicquot was only produced in 19 such and such a year, not 1935." It's like, oh my gosh, don't you have something better to do, But I love the fact that that
Mhm.
means the reader's paying attention,
Yeah.
and I will very proudly admit that they rarely get me wrong in on something wrong.
Yeah. Well, there you go. I like that.
Yeah.
So tell us the big story then for the trilogy for somebody new that's going to come and buy all three, obviously, because that's what we do here. And we leave great reviews because we want people to find and fall in love with you as an author. So give us the big story. What is kind of the overarching story of the trilogy? Kind of for the reader's sake, let's introduce that to them.
Okay. We're talking about a family that emigrates from Sweden to Nova Scotia around the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century. And the patriarch of the family is a sea captain, and he brings his wife with him. They have adopted three young orphaned girls in Sweden, and they bring these girls, obviously, to Nova Scotia with them. And he begins his career here in Nova Scotia as a sea captain. There were many steamships that left Yarmouth, Nova Scotia at this time, and exporting goods and then bringing back tourists. This was really the birth of the tourism industry in
Mm.
Nova Scotia at that time. So the story revolves around the daughter of one of those three little girls after they've grown up. And in Unconventional Daughters, which is the name of the first book, uh, she, and it's inspired by a true story, I might add. That's why I even got the idea to begin with. She ends up marrying her mother's second husband after her mother divorces him.
Wow.
That's the true part of the story. And I had some visual proof to back up and to give me some fodder for the story. And without getting into a ton of detail, it was from honeymoon letters written by this young woman to her mother in Nova Scotia in 1927, when this young woman was on her honeymoon with her mother's second husband in Europe. And I just kept thinking at the time that I read these letters with beautiful calligraphy, and they're very descriptive and evocative of the cities that she and her mother's second husband were visiting. I kept thinking, this is bizarre. I mean, it's mummy this and mummy that, and mummy, I'll bring back this stuff and that stuff that I've just bought for you. And a very matter of fact type of letters that a daughter would write to her mother, except that her husband was her mother's husband. And in real life, when when the young woman and her new husband came back to Nova Scotia after the honeymoon, the three of them lived together. So that's really the basis for how this family saga begins. It's unorthodox, and as is mentioned in the title, it's definitely unconventional. And I had to imagine what life for them would have been like in the 1920s and early 1930s in the Depression in a small town in Nova Scotia. The the type of prejudice that they would have experienced,
Yeah.
The turmoil of the Roaring Twenties and Prohibition going into the Great Depression, money gained, money lost, all that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
And so at the end of Unconventional Daughters, it's a positive ending because the main character does something with her life. I won't give away any
Yeah.
spoilers. And then I continued the so-called trilogy with her new life, but she wasn't the main character in the second book. The second book is about her best friend, who she happens to have met in the first book. And her best friend is a first generation Lebanese Canadian hotel manager. and he gets involved with a murder. Well, it's actually a murder mystery, but a murder that happens at the hotel um, that he works at in Halifax. And again, it's the mid 1930s. I found it so interesting to do the research on what it was like in Halifax, Canada at that time when we were going from a we had a conservative government going into an election when the rumors of war were starting to be heard from coming from Europe. And then when I realized that in Canada at the time in real life, we had a member of parliament or I better again, somebody will correct me on this.
Yeah.
Can't remember if he was a member of parliament or a member of the legislature in Quebec. But anyway, he was a journalist, but he was a Nazi. And he wanted to be the Canadian Führer, based on everything that was happening in Europe with Hitler at the time.
Mm.
So that's a subplot to book number two. And then at the end of book two, something happens and we jump ahead to 1956. And we're back to that original family and the grandson of the main character in book one. So if you aren't confused by now,
Get the books and read them. There you go.
right,
Right?
right, right.
When I first heard the story about these letters for the Unconventional Daughters, Bruce, I'm thinking, Bruce found this on a Google search and he saw pictures of them on a website and he wrote a book. And I was wrong. That's not how this happened. And I think for those that are listening, this story, and if you can kind of share this with me, because we talked about this before, but I want the listeners to hear the story behind these letters because it just opened up a total new world for me as far as a researcher and a journalist and a historian. The story behind the letters that sparked the first book. Can you please tell us this story? Because it's amazing.
Oh, sure. When I was 18 years old, I was in grade 12 and in Nova Scotia, in my hometown in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. And my mother gave me four handwritten letters at that time. And I was the editor of the high school newspaper. So that's really when I started writing, I guess. But she said, hang on to these things because someday you might use them for something. And I looked at these, weather beaten airmail type letters, not that difficult to read because the calligraphy, the handwriting was so beautiful. But I just thought, I don't know what I'm going to do with these things. And so literally they sat in my life, in my office, in my desk for 40 plus years until I decided to look at them again, transcribe them onto the computer so that to see if they made any sense at all, if I had all four of them in front of me. And and it was the story of this. Her real name was Julia. In the book, her name is Eva. In real life, they were Danish immigrants, not Swedish immigrants. I wanted to change a lot of family details just in case there might be still people around that could technically or whatever maybe take offense at the story. But the fact that it really did happen in Nova Scotia at the time, then it's the jump off of the turning point where I can start to do research on, okay, so what was life like in the 1920s in my hometown? And the more you dig, the more just little interesting tidbits you find, sadly, about racism, homophobia, social injustice,
Yeah.
issues that I'm very passionate in my own personal life. And so it's almost like the elements all came together and made me write the book. And once again, I'd never written a novel, so I knew I was breaking all kinds of rules until I saw someone online quote from the great English novel Evelyn Waugh, who said, "There's no rules. You do what you want. It's a novel. It's fiction. There aren't any rules to adhere to." There's basic standards, of course, that we have to do. But when I decided to put in an obituary or put in a newspaper column or jump around a bit in the chapters, I didn't know how it would be taken. I know there's some people that don't like that kind of jumping
Yeah.
into a different medium, like a newspaper column or an obituary. But to me, it brought much more life to the story. And I still have the letters, Dave. So
Wow.
if you ever need proof, I'll take a snapshot and send it to you, and you can
So how did
do
the
what you
letters
like.
get into your mother's possession, though?
Oh, yes, right. Well, the woman who had written them was in fact her neighbor. Now, we're talking about the 1950s, and it was before I was born.
Wow.
And my parents lived in an apartment. It was their first apartment. My brother and sister were very young children. And the house that my parents lived next door to was this big rambling mansion, essentially. And this woman would sit out on her back step every day, hang out her clothes to dry, sit in the back step, and just chain smoke. And eventually, because my mother would be out in her backyard, putting the clothes out to dry, she'd end up having a conversation with this woman. And eventually, Julia, the woman, gave my mother the four letters
Wow.
and said, "These are wonderful memories." And at that time, again, in the mid 1950s, Julia and her mother, who must have been like very elderly at that point, were only living in the kitchen of this mansion because they couldn't afford to buy oil for the furnace to
Hmm.
keep it warm. So, and the house is still there, or the mansion. It's a service organization now, all these years
Really?
later. But yeah, it's still there.
What did I see? Now that's a kind of story for someone that picks up the book and doesn't understand that part of the story that now just kind of opens up the story to us as a reader to know that you still have the letters, that you're holding these letters traveled great distance to get from sender to receiver and then stored in a box in their desk for 40 years. All of that went into writing the first book. So, like, what
Yeah.
a great appreciation as a reader now that when we pick up Unconventional Daughters, we have that as a foundation starting point as a reader. That's an amazing place to start from.
Well, I think it makes it a little bit more interesting when someone sees on the inside front cover inspired by a true incident, not necessarily a true story, because
Right.
I had to fictionalize their lives, but definitely inspired by a true incident. And the other neat thing that I was able to do was to go back to my hometown's library and archives and ask the archivist, is there any information here about that family that lived on such and such a street in this my gosh, she brought out a box of newspaper clippings and
Hmm.
photographs and all kinds of things dating back, but it wasn't from my main character's uh, world. It was the other sisters, the
Hmm.
two other sisters that emigrated to Nova Scotia in around 1900, and their stories are as interesting, except mostly everything was written in Danish, and it would take a monumental task to translate.
Well, if we have any Danish listeners, so we do have people from that part of the world, hey, I'm sure Bruce would love to have
Get
your
in touch,
services. Reach out. Bruce would like, 'cause maybe there's a book there. There could be,
maybe
right?
part four. Yeah,
Part four
yeah,
could be there. So if you want to help Bruce, click the link in the show notes and reach out to him. I'm sure he'd love to get your help. So you have the trilogy, and then you have your current release. Is there any connection between the trilogy and your current release? Are they completely different avenues? Kind of give us an idea on Grow Up Rory Rafferty.
yeah. Completely different
Okay.
storyline. As a child, I was uh, kind of fascinated growing up in a small town in Nova Scotia with how Nova Scotia and Nova Scotians are perceived by other people in Canada and or Americans. And there was I'm going to show my age here, but there was a movie that came out in 1970, a Canadian movie called Going Down the Road. And I literally snuck into the movie theater. I wasn't of age enough to buy a ticket, but I went to see the movie as a teenager. And it was about two ne'er-do-wells from Nova Scotia who leave in search of a better life in Toronto, the big city of Toronto.
Oh,
And I was so gobsmacked, I guess is the best word, by watching a movie in my movie theater of a real Canadian story of these, perceived as country bumpkins
Mhm.
moving to the big city. I guess I've never lost that idea about wanting to write a story about how maybe I felt when I left Nova Scotia as a 21-year-old and I moved to Ontario myself, to Toronto, and I ended up staying in Toronto for 25 years. But those first few years in Toronto, for a kid so naive and so impressionable and so dumb in so many respects, I wanted, I guess I wanted not an alter ego necessarily, but I wanted a main character who would go through those kinds of things that I did in the late 1970s. In fact, I didn't move to Toronto in real life until 1979, and that's the beginning of Grow Up Rory Rafferty. He's everybody, well, not everybody, but several people have said, "Oh, it's just your story." It's like, no, it's not my story, but I certainly had life incidents happen to me that are portrayed in the book. But no, I can't. I'm not one to write an autobiography or a biography. Or yeah, it's a series of things that happens to a actually in the book he's only 19, I think, that happened at that time in Canada's largest city at the height of the disco era.
There you go.
And yeah, I mean, it was wild. It was wild. And I hope that comes across in the book because some of the early reviewers or people who I still know from Toronto in those years who have gone on to, great things. Um, that was their youth as well. And they looked at the book, they read what's called an ARC, an advanced reader's copy, and sent back their impressions. And apparently, it's dead on, which makes me feel good. So, all the song titles I referred to, all the movies, all the restaurants, all the types of food, the decor in restaurants and bars and stuff like that. Apparently, I got it right because it's a fun book to read. It's a coming of age novel. It's not serious, not terribly serious.
Mm.
Um, and it's not a mystery. It's just a fun book to read. One of those early readers said this is the perfect book to take on your beach vacation,
Hmm.
and I took that as high compliment,
Wow.
actually. So,
So there's a lot of polyester then as well for that time frame.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. In fact, I think I've even mentioned on page one or something that when Rory is on the plane going to Toronto, the polyester shirt is sort of feeling clammy against his skin because he's not comfortable on the plane. And so many people have picked up on that first chapter, especially younger people who didn't realize or didn't know that everybody smoked on
Yep.
planes in
Yeah.
those days.
Right.
Everybody did, and it
Yeah.
was and peanuts. A stewardess, not a flight attendant, a stewardess would come
Right.
by and drop off your beer and your peanuts and think nothing of it as you're smoking your Export A or your Rothmans. I mean,
Right.
like
Yeah.
it's almost like it is a history lesson. I hate to again date myself, but it was 50 odd years ago. So
Yeah. And that, okay, so let's imagine you're hosting an event. Your main character is coming there to address the crowd and kind of, talk about the book and talk about his story. But you're the one that gets to introduce Rory to the group, to the audience. So you step up to the mic. Rory's standing off stage. You're going to introduce him, bring him up to the mic. Introduce him to us so that we know who this guy is, who this character is. But how would you introduce him to a group of people? What would you say about him? And how would you introduce him to this room full of people here to meet Rory for the first time?
okay. Rather than introduce him as if he's a real life character, what I'd like to do is just to read you what I'm calling an elevator pitch for the book,
Perfect. Perfect.
because it really is Rory's story. So,
Okay.
in 1979, when an introverted young man with culinary aspirations comes of age in Toronto, after taking his first job at a private women's club, he risks being devoured by the city's elite. So that's how you can picture Rory. He's an aspiring chef. He's like a fish out of water. He's in Canada's biggest city, and he lucks into this job as a busboy at a private women's club with really for the elite women of the city, whether they be executives or just filthy rich housewives. And then what happens to him when he begins to meet his coworkers and the members of the club? And believe me, I jam packed a lot of things into 300 odd pages.
Wow.
So
Okay.
that's Rory.
All
He's
right.
he's he's shy. Again, the fish out of water story. He learns to know and love himself
Hmm.
throughout the course of the book, which is really only 2 years, 1979 and 1980. And again, I can't give away any spoilers because there could be a part two if enough
Oh.
people, well, yeah, if enough people are interested.
So everyone,
So,
go to your computer right now, type up a message and send it off so that Bruce knows we need to make this into at least two books around Rory. It's exciting. So Bruce, again, let's kind of wrap up because I know you've got books to write, which is great. Uh, for the listeners, let's send them to your website because I'd be really interested to for them to connect with you, follow you on your social platforms, and again, let's open that communication and conversation. Maybe they want to take you out for dinner and talk to you about the books as well. I'm sure you love a free dinner.
sure.
Where do we send everybody? And then I want to close off with a question at the end.
Okay. Well, my website is pretty easy to remember. It's simply brucebishopauthor.com. And I am on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Threads. I would say, as far as books are concerned, my Facebook page, which I think is called Bruce Bishop Writer or B Bishop Writer or something like that, that's more related to my books. And like everybody, I've got other social media accounts that I don't pay all that much attention to. But no, definitely the website has a contact me page, and I'd love more people to sign up for the newsletter. And as I say, I send it out only every couple of months. I hate getting a lot of stuff in my mailbox, so I don't want to start sending out things every 3, 4 weeks myself.
Yeah.
You only send out a newsletter, in my opinion, as an author, when you've got something important to say. So,
Ooh, that's a good point. I like that. That's a really good point, Bruce. Okay, so I like to leverage the name of my show because it's kind of in the title. Beyond possibly writing more about Rory in the future, the show's living the next chapter. So I need to ask, Bruce, what are you doing to live your next chapter? It could be anything to do with writing. It could be completely outside of writing. What are you doing to live your next chapter?
oh, wow, that's a great question. Well, my post university training was in film and video production. That's when I got really interested years ago in writing scripts, and at one time raised enough money to do a 35 millimeter demo, 10 minute demo film based on a feature script that I had written. But that seems like, well, it was another century ago, I guess, technically now, but it does seem like eons ago. And I'd like nothing more than to have any of my 4 books produced as either a series, a TV series, which would be perfect with the first 3 with the trilogy,
Mm.
and or a standalone feature for Rory. I hope I live long enough to see some kind of a film or TV treatment made of one of the books or all of the books.
Mm.
So that's the dream, and that's the next chapter. I mean, I've already written the scripts for the pilot script for Unconventional Daughters, and I've written a standalone script for Uncommon Sons. So producers, hello, I'm happy to talk.
We will have Bruce's contact information in here. I know I have people who have been in Hollywood films. I've had people who've written for Netflix. I've had people on the show that are So they're part of our community here, and whether they're there to support you and help encourage you to keep going with this, or maybe they know someone that's listening today and going, I'm going to reach out to Bruce.
Well,
Maybe that's what we're going to put out there in the universe that's going to happen.
I think that's a great idea, Dave. And again, hope springs eternal, eh?
And you put the word A at the end of that, which made me very happy. Awesome, Bruce. Everybody listening, thank you for being here, listening to Bruce, and being on the show. There's the trilogy. Make sure you grab all three. And then also buy the Rory Rafferty book as well, Grow Up Rory Rafferty, and leave a review for all four of these books. Then also buy a second copy and send 4 books to your friends and family as well, so that they can follow the journey for Bruce. Let's help him and support him as readers. And that's why we do the show, is I want you to connect with great authors. If you live in Canada, reach out to Bruce and buy his books. If you live in Nova Scotia, come on, people. You have one of your own here. Support your local author. Bruce, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for giving us your time. Come back in the future and give us an update, please.
I would love to, and I really appreciate the time you've spent with me as well, Dave, and all the best with your series. I love your interviews.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. Glad to have you here. I just want to let you know that you can always find out what we're doing live in the moment by going to our YouTube channel. Head over to livingthenextchapter.com. There'll be a link right there. Head over to our YouTube channel. Make sure you like, subscribe, do all the things that all the YouTubers love to say. And in our YouTube channel, a couple things. You're going to get advanced listens. You're going to get the episodes that we're working on in real time. So we record and post daily on our YouTube channel. I'd love for you to give us a follow over there. As well, we're making playlists. We have over 500 episodes. So finding the right episode for you, we're trying to group things into playlists. So if you like children's books, if you like business, you like historical fiction, we're grouping our authors together to make it a little easier for you to find your favorite next author. So head over to livingthenextchapter.com. And again, I'd love to hear from you. Hearing from the listeners of the show is great. And I just want to say thank you for being a part of the podcast family. And I look forward to having you back for the next episode. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate your time and your listen. Take care.